Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about conformity and how it relates to perception. Last episode we talked about the Zimbardo prison experiment, in which a bunch of college students were assigned the role of either prisoner or of prison guard, and how they conformed to their roles and occupied it. And I made the argument that it was their role kind of acted as a sort of lens that they put on. And when they put on that lens, it distorted the way in which they perceived reality, such that they engaged in behaviors that were consistent with what they perceived the role should be doing. Today we're going to talk about just conformity in a more general sense and not with roles specifically, using two studies I find particularly thought-provoking. I am feeling a bit under the weather, and so if I am kind of a little bit foggy or slow, I attribute it to that instead of something else, I guess. So, first of all, we're going to talk about the Ash Conformity Study. In this study, if you look at the left, this is a picture of them conducting the study. There were a bunch of participants, and they were meant to rate whether a line was similar to another line, or which line length. Okay? If we take a look at the left, for example, this one is the length of the C line, but perhaps the funny answer would be to tell you it's the B line, but it's the C line. Except there's actually only one participant here. The others are all just actors. And so what Asch had the actors do is they would all answer unanimously correctly, and then occasionally they would all answer unanimously incorrectly. And if you take a look, it's a very easy sort of thing to take a look at and judge whether this line is equal to which length of the other ones. And so the idea is would a lot of people conform to the groupthink, even though it was a pretty easy, the task was supposed to be easy enough that you just couldn't get it wrong on your own, and if people did it on their own, I think they got like 100% right. It's been a while since I've read through this study, but what they noticed is they got a lot of answers wrong when the group was giving the wrong answer. And so a lot of people would chalk this up to saying, hey, they just decided to go with the group because they wanted to avoid social pressure, anxiety, all this types of stuff. But Solomon Asch also offered another alternative, which was it could just be going along with the social pressure. Or it could be that the social pressure was changing their very perception itself. Now, that is an important thing to sort of emphasize here, because you're saying that when you take a look at this, and you know everyone answered a particular way, it would warp your perception, much like how a sort of optical illusion warps your perception and give you a different look, so that you would actually think the A line is equal to the length of the figure on the left, or the B line. Okay? And so this study was done in the 50s, and it was done kind of, again, it's another one of these studies that was done at the back of World War II, or like inspired by the events of the Nazis, and like how do these people turn out so evil, and this sort of thing. And so the question was will people just conform kind of blindly, and like how do they conform and what causes them to conform? These were the types of things that they wanted to answer. And it wasn't until 50 years later that a man by the name of Gregory Berns, who is a neurologist or neurobiologist, came up with a way to sort of test this kind of thesis. It's not like fully complete in terms of sussing out whether or not the conformity is perceptual or, some sort of higher order cognitive decision to go along with the group. But what he did is he hooked them up to fMRI machines while they did the subject. And so if we take a look at his study, which was called, Neurobiological Correlates of Social Conformity and Independence During Mental Rotation. So his was not like the line study. If we take a look at the line study, this is really easy to do. And his study was a little bit harder, and he argued that it was necessary for it to be a little bit harder. But what they're doing is they're taking a look at a three-dimensional object, and they're trying to decide, is it the same object that's rotated, or is it a mirror image of the object and thus not the same object? Again, there were Confederates, and the Confederates would all answer the same most of the time, or I think, like a third of the time they would answer the same, and a third they would answer all wrong, and then a third was like a control group where they didn't answer at all, and then there were 6 bonus ones where it would be a mixed bag between them saying all same or all different, either incorrectly or correctly. And the idea for this was to make the study more believable, but they tossed out those questions in terms of the analysis at the end, because they're looking for the conformity. There was a second area in which there was a control, and that is, it's not just that it's a social group, it's also just external stimulus. And so what they did is they had a computer group as well, and the computer group did the exact same thing as the social group. And so what they were testing was the differences between the computer group and the social group. Those differences would be ascribed to a social sort of thing, because the computer also happened to give an external stimulus. At the end of the experiment, when the participants rated how reliable they thought the computers were and how reliable they thought the group was, they rated them roughly the same reliability. But they conformed to the group way more than they did the computer group. And, okay, that makes sense. And here's the bigger question is, well, what area of the brain was being stimulated? Because this is how they were going to decide whether it was social pressure, in terms of, oh, I'm going to decide to go along with the group because I think that that's a smart decision. You know, I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to be the only one to get this answer wrong, like this sort of thing. Or was it warping their very perception? And what they found was the areas of the brain that were the most stimulated were the areas associated with perception, which suggests that their very perception itself was changing. It wasn't a higher order area of the brain that is like associated with cognitive dissonance. This is how he describes it in the book, not as much as in the study, but it's not the higher order part of the brain associated with cognitive dissonance, which is what you would expect if you had someone struggling with perceiving reality much different than the group. Okay, well, what are the takeaways from this sort of thing? First of all, I think that this is really alarming, because what it suggests is that your very perception of reality, generally we consider our basic order, like, sensory faculties to be extremely reliable. But if our basic order sensory faculties can distort lines like this and make us think that the lines are proper length when there's no real optical illusion at play, but it plays like an optical illusion, then that means that's something that is much more vague or abstract, like justice, you know, freedom, like these esoteric concepts that we consider important to ourselves, love, like all this stuff. What it suggests is these are probably even more vulnerable to a sort of pressure that is entirely social and is not grounded in, let's say, objective fact. So, on one hand, I think it's extremely alarming. On another hand, this is probably actually just generally a very useful adaptation. If you think about the caveman days, you know, if all the cavemen are running in one direction, and you look over and it looks safe, it'd probably be smarter for you just to run along with them, even if you think it's safe. You know, because the group, when the group is all working collectively to find a decision, one, the group is generally right. And two, being ostracized from the group is extremely disadvantageous in terms of, like, an adaptation. You know, this is why social pressure and anxiety is very, very intense in a lot of individuals. It's a very useful adaptation, because if you're talking about caveman times, being ostracized from the group is really, really, really bad. Like, you are 100% screwed, gonna die, you, like, living on your own. That's a no-go. It doesn't quite work with, like, modern day times, because if you won't get completely ostracized from a group, you can kind of just find another group, so it doesn't quite follow the same pattern. But it would be a generally useful adaptation. I think it's still, even in modern society, it's a generally useful adaptation that you have the... because a lot of the time when the group sees something differently as you probably just see it wrong. But, it's still very alarming, because it is not happening at, like, a layer that we like. You know, it's happening in response to social pressure, not in response to us seeing it differently. Something interesting that wasn't mentioned in the study, but he talks about in his book, is just having one dissident or one person disagree with in the scrum of 5, or in the scrum of more in the case of the Asch Conformity Study. When there was just one person disagreeing, it then became incredibly easy for you to for you to break away from the group conformity. So if all but one say, no, this is the wrong length, and one breaks away from the group, it becomes incredibly easy for you to break away from the group. Okay, so more takeaways is that kind of this is like a detail in philosophy, or like an idea that's common in philosophy, is that we kept coming back to these rose-colored lenses. And philosophy, they like to get really abstract and analyze stuff at a level that others would probably find frivolous. But one of the things that a lot of people in philosophy believe is that the senses are incredibly unreliable. And I think that this is, in a lot of ways, it is both true, and also at the same time, the senses are what you have to go with. So you gotta make peace with that unreliability. And so I think it is important to be able to shift gears quite rapidly with information, and not necessarily be stuck in your inability to like reconsider stuff. And so even if you are doomed to conform and say that B is the same length as this line over on the left figure, being able to be flexible is important so that you can change your mind. In terms of practically speaking, the takeaway from these types of studies, they are where these can really go haywire, this type of effect that I think is still generally useful, is that if you put yourself in an echo chamber of any kind related to any topic, it's easy to talk about like political echo chambers, but really any topic. Like if you work at a business and everyone in your local, like in your particular corporation, thinks that the right way to do something is XYZ way, and other companies think is ZYX, it's bad if all the people think the same thing, because you're going to get stuck in echo chambers and groupthink. Same thing with like politically, or hanging out with people who they just all agree with you. And so being able to pull from different areas to have different opinions and different perspectives, I think is important to minimizing how this effect can be negative in your own life. Because if you surround yourself with people who just agree with you, it is going to, or people who just all have the same perspective, it is reasonable to expect that this will warp your perception. And since this warping or this distortion happens at a very perceptual level, like a very base level, it is invisible to you to the degree in which things are getting distorted, right? To use the metaphor of the lenses again, you're looking through the lenses, you don't actually see the lenses. And I should really get a pair of glasses or lenses for this metaphor, but you're not taking them off and looking at them, you're looking through them. And so it's invisible to you, and this is one of the reasons why this type of effect is really pernicious. I think last episode we talked about how eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, and one of the reasons why is because memory is really unreliable. And when you are looking through the lens of your memory, you don't see it as being unreliable. And so one of the things to consider is that when everyone agrees, they're probably right, but they might not be right. And so it is important to be able to look and search for other information, because recall, if there's one dissenter, then that pretty much erases the effect of this social pressure to think that this line is equal to B or A, because it's equal to C. I should have joked from the start that it was equal to B. That would have been funny and perhaps a way to enrage people in the comments. But so this is like one of the things that I think is really important to take away from this conformity study that was done by Solomon Asch as well as Gregory Berns. Gregory Berns really brought in, the idea that, let's get to him. that it happens at a point in which is distorting your very perception. And he writes about this in his book Iconoclast, where he also includes a bunch of other ways that allow you to think differently from the group, or if you're Steve Jobs, think different from the group. And I think that this book is a fairly good read. I don't think I have a review of it, but I think it's a good read, along with his book Satisfaction, which I think presents an interesting model for achieving satisfaction. Comes from a neurobiology perspective. He argues you need dopamine and cortisol, which is the same as saying you need novelty and to be challenged. I think it's good. Yeah, looking back, this is a very easy puzzle to do, and it's important to stress that lots of people got this wrong and were unaware that they were getting it wrong as well. And that is because if your perception's being distorted, you don't have a way of knowing if it's being distorted, and so of course you're unaware that it's being distorted. And so this is kind of painting a broader picture regarding this like glasses narrative, where you have a composite through which you perceive reality. Let's call them glasses, binoculars, whatever. And these are influenced by a variety of factors. One of them being roles, as discussed with the Zimbardo prison experiment. Another one being, just social pressure, general social pressure, as discussed with the Asch study and the Berns study. And this is like something where if you don't ever try and like take it off and look at it, it's just going to forever color your life, and it will distort your ability to suss out what's accurate and what's not. And I find it really concerning today with the Asch and the Berns ones talking about echo chambers, because people are able to online, find groups of people who all think alike. And generally speaking, you will like people who think the same as you. And so it is very easy to, surround yourselves with people who just agree with you. And this is not, if you want to be able to look at reality objectively, this is really bad. It's just a very bad thing. And so I think I discussed earlier, one of the ways you can, combat this is to constantly try and consume ideas you disagree with. This is something I advocate with book reading all the time. It's actually caused me to read books that I, going into it, thought were going to be extremely wrong, but ended up, really changing my opinion about stuff. In particular, the case against competition. I thought competition was, transcendentally truth-revealing, and then I read this book, and then I'm like, well, I'm not fully on board with everything in this book, but, competition definitely isn't transcendentally truth-revealing, and is quite damaging in a lot of different areas, even in, business and stuff like this. And so I'm in danger of rambling now, because I'm about to repeat what I'm going to say about, echo chambers, but knowing that even your physical perception itself can be really unreliable, I think is an important tool to have in your analysis belt, with the asterisk, and I kind of discussed this early, that you have to trust in your faculties to some extent, but you should trust in them to the extent that is necessary, and then be radically willing to change your perspective in the light of new evidence, and also to try and interpret arguments as generously as possible. This is a very Platonic sort of idea. That way you can be more resistant against these sorts of effects that would cause you to think that this line is equal to the A or the B line, or to not be able to mentally rotate somewhat basic three-dimensional objects. And there's Gregory Berns. Gregory Berns also, to wrap this up, just to talk a little bit more about him, he also makes an interesting argument, I haven't read it, where he argues that there's a criteria for personhood, and he argues that dogs fit that criteria, and therefore dogs are people. It's a bit interesting, maybe worth looking into if you're a dog person. I'm not super much a dog person, but conceptually it's interesting to me. Anyways, as far as discussion goes, does anyone have any other instances where they feel that perception was altered by like social conformity, or like has heard anything else about this? I think Gregory Berns is kind of like the only person who's tested like the neurocorrelates involved with, or at least at 2005 time, he was the only one who tested to what degree the neural correlates, what's going on in your brain, were associated with conformity, which I think is really interesting, because before his study, it'd be really easy to like be like, no, it's just people going along with the group. They're being socially pressured. They're being pussies, and, I wouldn't do that. And then to find out that it's changing your perception, and you can't say my perception wouldn't be changed because you don't know if it would be changed or not. It just gets changed, right? It's not like you were faced with a decision and you chose the easy way out. You weren't faced with a decision. You just saw reality differently than how it was. And so I think that that's significant. All right, I'm rambling now. Discussion, if anyone wants to mention anything about like optical illusions or perception being altered or perception being unreliable, these sorts of things, or have a suggestion for a study that's kind of fitting along the same vein as, these like rose glasses or whatever, feel free to put it in the comments. I'll try and address it. If I was repetitive or anything like that, or a little bit foggy, like right now I feel pretty foggy. I'm pretty sure I have COVID. I'm just staying at home, and the brain's a little foggy, so I hope this was intelligible. If it's not intelligible and I watch it back later, I'll probably re-record it, but hoping on that, and have a good day.